They didn't see a boy. They saw a survival strategy. They didn't see a child. They saw a cellular disaster wrapped in velvet. Behind the golden doors of the Alcazar, a secret was breathing. A secret that couldn't chew, couldn't speak, and couldn't stop shaking. This is not the story of a king. This is the story of a crime committed by a family against their own blood. Silence is a sound. In the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, on November 6, 1661, the silence was deafening. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone is looking at a nightmare and pretending it is a miracle. The Queen had given birth. The King had an heir. Spain had a future. But the midwives knew better. They saw the blue tint in the skin. They saw the jaw that hung open like a broken hinge. They saw the eyes that didn't focus on the light, but on some internal ghost. Charles II was not born. He was assembled from the wreckage of a dying family tree. For 200 years, the House of Habsburg had been playing a dangerous game with God. They didn't want outside blood. They wanted purity. They wanted to keep the gold and the titles within the circle. But nature does not like circles. Nature likes branches. When a family tree stops branching and starts looping back on itself, it becomes a noose. His father, Philip IV, was his mother's uncle. His mother, Mariana, was her husband's niece. It was a union that felt less like a marriage and more like a laboratory experiment gone wrong. Charles was the result. He was the final product of 2 centuries of incest. The Habsburg jaw, once a proud symbol of royalty, had reached its limit in him. It was no longer a feature. It was a deformity. His lower teeth could not meet his upper teeth. His tongue was a heavy, swollen muscle that he could not pull back into his mouth. From his first breath, speech was a war he was destined to lose. But they didn't care about his tongue. They cared about his head. They needed it to hold a crown. They baptized him in incense and gold. They wrapped his crooked legs in the finest silk. They called him the Desired One. But behind the masks, the doctors whispered in Latin. They saw the soft bones. They saw the seizures that twisted his small frame like a dying bird. They knew he was a shadow. The empire was crumbling. From the Netherlands to the New World, the Spanish sun was setting. They needed a lion to lead them. Instead, they got a lamb born with a broken heart. They decided to lie. They decided that if they bowed low enough, no one would notice the king couldn't stand. They decided that if they prayed loud enough, the world wouldn't hear the king's wet, struggling breath. The tragedy of Charles began before he could even crawl. He was a prisoner of his own DNA, trapped in a palace of mirrors where no one allowed him to see his true face. The quiz. What was the real cause of the king's curse? A. Black magic. B. French spells. C. Royal blood. D. Ancient demons. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights and more quizzes. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. A crown is meant to be a symbol of strength. For Charles, it was a heavy burden that threatened to snap his neck. By the age of 4, most children are running and laughing. Charles was still a secret kept in the dark. He did not walk, he swayed. His muscles were like wet clay, unable to hold the weight of his own history. When he finally took his first step, it wasn't a triumph. It was a tragedy. He moved like a puppet with tangled strings, his oversized head pulling him toward the cold marble floors of the palace. In 1665, his father died. Philip IV left behind a kingdom in debt and a son who could barely hold up his own hand. At the age of 4, the boy with the swollen tongue became the king of Spain. They put him on a throne that felt like a mountain. They draped him in velvet that weighed more than his bones. The court knew the truth, but they had become masters of the lie. To admit the king was broken was to admit the empire was finished. So, they performed a daily play. The ministers ruled while Charles stared into the distance. They wrote the laws while Charles struggled to breathe. Behind closed doors, the whispers became a storm. The servants watched him drool onto his silk collars. They watched his eyes roll back in his head as seizures claimed his mind. They called it the falling sickness. They said it was a spiritual trial. But it wasn't a spirit, it was his nervous system collapsing under the weight of his ancestry. Charles was never allowed to be a child. He was a relic. He was surrounded by gold, but he was starving for a single moment of honesty. No one told him why his jaw wouldn't close. No one explained why he felt like a stranger in his own body. He was the most powerful man in the world on paper, but in reality, he was a prisoner of the Alcazar. He was a boy living in a museum of his family's mistakes. The Jesuits tried to teach him. They brought him books, maps, and Latin verses. But the words were ghosts to him. His brain, clouded by fluid and the pressure of a malformed skull, could not hold onto the shapes of letters. He would stare at a page for hours, his mouth slightly open, eyes fluttering. He wasn't lazy. He was absent. He was a candle trying to burn in a room with no oxygen. Spain needed a leader, but they had built a king out of glass, and the world was starting to throw stones. The quiz. What silenced the truth in the royal court? A. Fear of God. B. Price of gold. C. Lack of words. D. Threat of treason. Marriage in the House of Habsburg was not about love. It was about math. It was about keeping the borders of the map and the blood in the veins exactly where they were. But for Charles, marriage was the ultimate cruelty. In 1679, they brought him a bride from France, Marie-Louise of Orleans. She was young, vibrant, and full of life. She was a Bourbon, a daughter of the sun, sent to live in a house of shadows. When she first saw Charles, she didn't see a husband. She saw a warning. He stood at the altar, his skin the color of old parchment, his jaw jutting out like a broken ledge. He tried to speak to her, but the words were thick and slurred, trapped behind teeth that didn't fit together. He reached for her hand with fingers that trembled from a nervous system on the brink of failure. She kissed his cheek, but her heart was back in the gardens of Versailles. The court demanded a miracle. They didn't want a happy couple. They wanted an heir. They needed a boy to carry the name so the empire wouldn't shatter. But the tragedy of the Habsburgs had reached its biological dead end. Charles was not just deformed on the outside, he was hollow on the inside. His body was a map of inherited ruin. He approached intimacy with the confusion of a child, frightened and stiff. The nights in the royal bedchamber were not filled with passion, but with a heavy, suffocating silence. Marie-Louise tried. She smiled for the painters. She held his hand in the public squares. She watched him struggle to eat his mashed food while the nobles whispered behind their fans. She saw him collapse in the middle of dinner, his body jerking in the grip of a seizure, while the priest sprinkled holy water and called it a blessing. She was the Queen of Spain, but she was really a nurse in a golden cage. The failure to produce a child became a national crisis. The ministers blamed her. They said she was too French. They said her womb was cursed. But the truth lived in the king's blood. His cells were a loop, a snake eating its own tail. He was the final product of generations of relatives marrying relatives, and nature had finally said no. In 1689, Marie-Louise died at the age of 26. Some said it was poison. Others said it was a broken heart. Charles was devastated. He didn't just lose a wife. He lost the only person who had looked at him with something resembling kindness. He was alone again, a broken king in a rotting palace, waiting for a future that would never come. The quiz. Why did the royal marriage fail? A. Secret war. B. Cellular collapse. C. French spies. D. Royal debt. After the death of Marie-Louise, the palace did not mourn. It moved like a machine. Within months, a new bride was brought in, Maria Anna of Neuburg. She was not a romantic, she was a politician. She saw Charles not as a man, but as a vacancy. She realized quickly that the king was no longer a ruler. He was a shadow, and shadows are easy to move. The king's health was now a spectacle of horror. His mind began to fracture. He grew afraid of the sun. He claimed the devil lived in the wells of the palace. He refused to bathe, believing that water would wash away his soul. This was the era of El Hechizado, the bewitched. The court could not admit that their king was the victim of bad biology, so they claimed he was the victim of bad magic. They said witches had sewn his tongue shut. They said demons were pulling at his limbs. Maria Anna encouraged this. It was easier to rule through a bewitched husband than a sick one. She summoned exorcists instead of doctors. The royal bedchamber became a theater of the occult. Priests circled the king, chanting in Latin, throwing holy water onto his pale, bloated face. They placed the bones of saints under his pillow and relics of martyrs on his chest. Charles lay there, twitching and foaming at the mouth, believing that he was a battlefield for heaven and hell. But there were no demons in the room. There was only the sound of his own heavy, rattling breath. His body was failing. His stomach could no longer hold solid food. His urine was turning dark. His skin was covered in sores that would not heal. He would stand at the windows of the Alcazar for hours, staring at a horizon he would never reach. He asked his servants if he was ever a child. He wondered if his life was a dream or a punishment. The empire was watching. France, Austria, and England were like vultures circling a dying animal. They sent spies to count his seizures. They sent ambassadors to smell his breath. Everyone wanted to know when the candle would finally flicker out. And in the center of the storm was Charles, a man who had been given everything but owned nothing. He was surrounded by powerful men and ambitious women, yet he was the most isolated soul in Europe. He lived in a palace of silk and marble, but his true home was a prison of bone and blood. He was waiting for permission to die. The quiz: who truly controlled the king's mind? A. Holy priests. B. Dark witches. C. Political ambition. D. Royal ghosts. By 1698, the performance was over. The king was no longer a man. He was a ruin. Charles II was only 36 years old, but he looked like a ghost that had been dragged through the dirt. His body had entered its final rebellion. His legs, once merely weak, were now swollen like sacks of wet flour. His stomach was a hard, bloated mound, while his arms and legs were thin as sticks. He was a living contradiction, a man who was both evaporating and heavy with fluid. The smell in the royal chambers changed. It was no longer the scent of expensive incense and orange blossoms. It was the scent of rot. It was the smell of a body decaying while the heart was still beating. His breath was sour, a thick vapor of failing organs. The doctors, finally allowed back into the room, spoke in hushed, terrified tones. They used leeches. They used blessed salt. They used crushed pearls. They were trying to repair a shattered vase with spit and prayer. It was useless. Charles spent his days in a state of half-consciousness. He would wake up and ask for Marie-Louise, forgetting she had been in the ground for nearly a decade. He would look at the paintings of his ancestors on the walls, the men with the same heavy jaws and the same cold eyes, and he would scream. He realized, in his brief moments of clarity, that he was the bill for their debts. He was the price they paid for their pure blood. He told his confessor, "I am a punishment." Outside the palace, the world was preparing for his end. Diplomats were not talking about his health anymore. They were talking about his map. France and Austria were sharpening their swords. They weren't waiting for a king to die, they were waiting for an estate to open. The king was the only thing standing between Europe and a sea of blood, and he was held together by nothing more than a few ragged breaths. He was forced to sign his final will. His hand, guided by ministers who had already sold their loyalty to France, trembled across the parchment. He named Philip of Anjou as his heir. With that stroke of a pen, he ended the Habsburg line in Spain. He signed away the history of his fathers because he was too tired to hold on to it any longer. He lay back into his pillows, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, and whispered, "Let it stop." He was a candle that had burned down to the wax, flickering in a drafty room, waiting for the dark to finally take him home. The quiz. What did the king's breath reveal? A. Royal power. B. Holy Spirit. C. Internal decay. D. Secret poison. On November 1st, 1700, the weight of the crown finally became too much for the man beneath it. It was All Saints' Day. Outside the palace walls, the bells were ringing, a constant, rhythmic tolling that sounded like the counting of a final pulse. Inside, the room was thick with the smoke of 100 candles and the heavy, humid breath of the dying. Charles II lay on his bed, a figure of white skin and dark shadows. He was 38 years old, but his body was an ancient relic of a time that had passed. The end did not come with a roar. It came with a sigh. His heart, which the later autopsy would describe as the size of a peppercorn, simply stopped trying. The struggle was over. The man who had been a symbol, a victim, and a prisoner was finally free. The silence that filled the room was different now. It wasn't the silence of a secret, it was the silence of a void. The House of Habsburg in Spain had officially ended. The fire that had burned across the globe for 2 centuries had gone out in a cold, damp room in Madrid. The autopsy was a final insult to his dignity. The doctors cut open the king to see what had been wrong with the empire. They found a nightmare. His lungs were black. His intestines were rotten. His brain was filled with water. He was a man who had been decaying since the day he was conceived. He was the biological tax for 200 years of royal pride. They washed his body, wrapped him in gold, and buried him in the dark marble depths of the Escorial. They placed his name on a tomb, but they could not bury the chaos he left behind. As soon as his heart stopped, the peace of Europe shattered. The War of the Spanish Succession began. Over 400,000 people would die in the fires that followed. The world was being torn apart because of a man who could never even tie his own shoes. The kings of Europe fought over his colonies and his gold, but no one fought for his memory. He was forgotten almost as soon as the dirt hit his coffin. Charles II was not a monster. He was not a tyrant. He was a boy who was never allowed to be a person. He was a breathing monument to the danger of looking backward. His life was a tragedy written by his ancestors, a story of how blood can become poison when it is never allowed to mix with the world. In the end, he was just a human being who wanted to be heard, but was born into a body that refused to speak. The crown was polished, the throne was high, but the man was only ever dust. The quiz. What did the king's death trigger? A. Eternal peace. B. Continental war. C. Golden age. D. Royal silence. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.